right, everyone. This is Mr. E, also known as the Bearded Music Teacher on Twitter. Make sure that you check it out. It's MR underscore E underscore FC or Music FCS. One of those two. Type in Music FCS or FCS Music. I think it's Music FCS. But, anyways, that is my professional Twitter handle. It is early in the morning when I'm recording this podcast. So, I'm enjoying my coffee while we are talking about the music markets of the mid 1950s. Now, what you have to realize is that certain publishers and certain record labels had certain like you would consider them niches, if you will. Or what I mean by that is certain things that they like to produce. So, you'll see this a lot of times with record labels. If you look at, for example, Nuclear Blast Records, which is known for the heavier side of metal, they're not going to probably sign a K-pop group anytime soon, or any BTS uh, type vocal group, or NSYNC, or the Backstreet Boys, or anything like that. They're more along the lines of the heavier stuff. So the mainstream pop music was designed to appeal to a broad but mostly white middle class. Now, for the topic of our discussion, I understand that some people may be sensitive to race. For our discussion, we are going to use the term African American um, in most cases. There'll be sometimes where I say black, but that's because it's culturally, historically accurate. So please do not take offense with that, but I know that that tends to be a bit of an issue, especially for my students. They may kind of be like, "Oh, what?" But a lot of them, I guess, don't really care. Anyway, so there there are three record labels that are big during this time, and you see them on the slide here. Of course, again, remember, if you're listening to this podcast, this is a video and a podcast all in one recording at this time. So this is for my students, and so they have a slide deck that they're looking at while they're either watching the video or they are listening to this podcast. So the three major record labels are Columbia, Decca, and then RCA Victor. All right, and again, these are the American record labels. Okay, and we'll see how like EMI kind of has another uh, EMI in Britain is transfers over to America when we talk about the Beatles and stuff. But anyways, these labels tend to stay out of R&B, so rhythm and blues, country, western, and other smaller markets, partly because they considered their profitability margin to be limited, and partly because they tried to work in these markets and they found it not to be good. So not only did it create this whole uh, the idea of making a profit in a business, they couldn't make a profit. In other words, I'll just do it that way. They couldn't make a profit. It was terrible them making a profit, and they found it to be very, very hard to grow in the markets that just weren't simply marketed toward the middle class that tended to have money, and the upper class tended to listen to either pop music or classical music. So it was kind of this thing where it's like, well, we got to go to where the most money is, and that would be mainstream pop audiences, which were primarily at this point white Americans. Now, let's talk about the subsets here. I call them the subsets. Um, and they're like country music. So we have these different groups of music that kind of represent a regional flavor of what I talked about in previous podcasts. Country music, not Western music, but country music in the Southeast in the 1930s remained regional until after 1945 due to World War II. You'll have these guys that enlisted, guys and girls, or men and women, I should say, men and women enlist in the military during World War II from the Southeast of the United States, take their country music with them, and then they share it among the other GIs that are the in the in the Army or Navy. or Air Force. All right. So Nashville, after this in the late 40s, was the established center. All right. And country music is known for Nashville and the Grand Ole Opry. And that'll come into play later on. But one that we need to be particularly focused on is Ralph Peer. He's a producer who traveled to the South in search of record companies, of what record companies would soon call hillbilly music. So Ralph Peer would travel down, find these uh, these southern music artists, and call it hillbilly music. And there's some very interesting names that come out of it. For example, Fiddlin' John Carson and Gid Tanner and his Skillet Lickers. Yes, that was the name. Gid Tanner and his Skillet Lickers, and the Carter family. Those are the three main ones. Due to copyright, I'm not going to be playing these on the podcast or on the video that we currently are recording right now. But I encourage you guys to listen to, and in class we do a discussion and listening with Cripple Creek. We talk about the stereotypes that were involved in the lyrics and how those may or may not be acceptable today, and how those really impact the music and the Southern mentality and the Southern stereotypes. Now, another one is Western music. And the reason why I pair these two together back to back in my discussion is that eventually country and Western music become country Western. Now, Western music was more associated with the cowboys on the open prairies, the idea of going out west and expanding out west. And this was mainly brought forth by Hollywood. Hollywood really did a lot of stuff with like Lone Ranger. And so they were like, hey, let's do this. And they put a guy by the name of Gene Autry, who was an actor and also a musician. He could actually play guitar. And so the image came where the cowboy was sitting on his horse playing guitar, or sitting at the campfire in the evenings playing his guitar and just singing about the day and singing about his worries and things like that. So Gene Autry was the main guy. That was the main head guy. The women, Patsy Montana, she did a song called I Want to Be a Cowboy's Sweetheart. So I would highly recommend listening to that song, as well as Back in the Saddle Again by Gene Autry. Now, we also have this thing called Western Swing, which was really championed by Bob Willis and his Texas Playboys, and Milton Brown and his Musical Brownies. These guys were interesting. If you want to talk about, when I hear Western Swing, I think of line dance. So yeah, we'll just leave it at that. Now, one of the landmark ones in 1940 was New San Antonio Rose. And that was an example of an eclectic stylistic blend of the dance band of the Northeast with the rough and tumble Western hoedown stompers of the Southwest. And this song was actually redone by Bing Crosby in 41, a year later, and it took it to a national hit. So out of the Western music, I would highly recommend Back in the Saddle, I Want to Be a Cowboy's Sweetheart, and New San Antonio Rose. And listen to the original version, if you can find the original version, and the Bing Crosby version. All right. Bob Willis and the Texas Playboys, I believe, were the ones that did the original version. And in class, we listened to that version and talk about how it's different than country music. Now, one of the champions out of that was Jimmy Rogers. And he died of tuberculosis at 36. He was known for his image of this guy that was just riding the railway, was riding the trains all over the country with his guitar and just singing. Kind of like this rustic back porch guitar picker and singer wandering the country. And he had one big song in 1927 called Blue Yodel. Now, this is where we kind of jump into the 1970s, I want to say, maybe. It was right around the time of Leonard Skinner. In fact, Leonard Skinner is the main character of this. Leonard Skinner took Blue Yodel, which became a huge like anthem, if you will, for this kind of Western country star. All right. They took that song and used it by the name that was often called. Instead of Blue Yodel, it was often called T for Texas. And Leonard Skinner made a huge hit out of this one by covering that song. And so in class, again, what we do is we listen to the original version, then we listen to the one by Skinner. And my a lot of the kids in my class are like, "Whoa, that's so cool! Leonard Skinner is awesome! Freebird!" And I'm like, "Yeah." And Sweet Home Alabama, yeah. But T for Texas is a good one. That's a lot of people don't know, and some people are like, "Well, that's a deep cut." No, no, not really. They were really known for what the original lineup was really known for doing that song, and still today, I remember seeing Leonard Skinner when, oh, gosh, it's now been over 10 years ago, but I think they were around with Blackstone Cherry and somebody else on tour, and I saw them in Cincinnati, Ohio, and they actually played T for Texas. Um, so it's something that they still even do with their modern lineup today. But again, Jimmy Rogers becomes the country star, and then the Grand Ole Opry starts coming in as the actual radio station. It started out as a radio station at the time. So another one that we need to be aware of is Hank Williams. Now, Hank Williams started in the early 1950s, and he is really that country star that put the image of the singer-songwriter from Alabama. But his first song was actually done by Molly O'Day, which was a pop artist in '46. Um, and then he slowly branched out. He slowly got his big break with the Louisiana Hayride for KWKH out of Shreveport. And then in in about a year's time, in the summer of '49, he became a regular on the Grand Ole Opry. That's how quickly he jumped to stardom. Now, he's known for songs of Your Cheatin' Heart, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, and Hey Good Lookin'. Those three songs have been covered by so many artists. It is unbelievable. And the reason why is because it's a good song. These are good songs. All right. So if you're a huge fan of country and western music, I just listed a bunch of stuff from Gid Tanner and the Skillet Lickers, which is more like a bluegrassy kind of thing, country, old rustic country. Jimmy Rogers, T for Texas, Blue Yodel slash Blue Yodel, New San Antonio Rose, Back in the Saddle, I Want to Be a Cowboy's Sweetheart. These are all, and then Your Cheating Heart, Cold, Cold Heart, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry, Hey Good Looking. These are all amazing classic country artists and their tracks. It's amazing. It's actually mind blowing to listen to. You're like, whoa, that's awesome. Now, one other thing that we have to cover before we get too crazy into this is the idea of the Delta and urban blues. And this became known as rhythm and blues after World War II. And it was popular by black artists and for African American artists and African American audiences. This was the blues that originated in the predominantly African American culture. And after World War I, blues had enjoyed several years of popularity with the mainstream white listeners, but partly through the popular sheet music of W.C. Handy, whose Memphis Blues and St. Louis Blues were the two that really came out and made that big kind of thing. Now, later on, Robert Johnson, who represented the idea of rural blues, he would eventually influence Eric Clapton, which later went on to do tons of things and then a solo career and all this other great stuff. But he also influenced and was around like Muddy Waters, B.B. King. These all came out of this Delta and urban blues kind of thing. So in '36, the Crossroads Blues is a great example of the Robert Johnson sound. That is, to me, that is like the go-to song of where I feel Delta and urban blues started. That to me is like the pinnacle of that sound. Now the electric blues spread from Memphis to Chicago in the early 50s, making it the most important blues center in the country. The scenes in both Memphis and Chicago remain relatively isolated from one another, as well as from similar music in other cities across the country. So Memphis develops their own flavor of blues, while Chicago they drift off up to Chicago with the urban migration. And if you talk about this in U.S. history, you'll know what I'm talking about. But in Chicago, they take that Southern blues style and they bring it up in what's known as called urban blues later on to that. Now, Louis Jordan and his Timpani Five became popular with pop listeners with the GI Jive and the Choo Choo Boogie. Those are two that would definitely be good out of those things. Now, one last thing before we end this episode is the idea of the market for the blues. All right, we talked about the major record labels, Decca, Columbia, and RCA Victor, and really the country and western kind of stayed on the radio. There was some vinyl and some record labels on that one. But the commercial radio makes its profit from selling advertising time. Okay, now this is where we're going to start talking about the markets for the blues. And the big question is, after they transition to TV, how do the radio stations make money? Well, they tend to gravitate toward these things of like blues and other local regional things. So, to reach a particular kind of listener, the radio station would program music as well as sell advertisements to local entities or local companies that were specific to their audience. So, if you knew that you were and back in the time they called them black stations, we're going to call them African American stations for right now. If they knew that the market was geared toward African Americans, they would promote African American run businesses or African American run ideals or products or things like that. So that's where they ended up making a lot of money, is that they would sell these advertisements which would help support and sponsor these African American communities. And the R&B would then support the R&B music would then support the communities by having airtime and things like that. Now, how do we get there? Well, the minor record labels of blues, things like Sun Records in Memphis, Chess Records in Chicago, which Chess Records plays a huge key role in the beginning of rock, King in Cincinnati, and Atlantic in New York. These were just a few of R&B labels that were successful. Now, Decca did reach their toe, same with RCA Victor and Columbia, Capitol, MGM, and Mercury. They all kind of dabbled. They did see some success in it. It wasn't like the country and western where they're like, eh, but the major record labels did see some eventual success. Then the indie labels, the independent labels, the smaller ones, would pick up the western, country and western at the same time. Now, the white teenagers would also listen to the African American stations. So back then, the teenagers were trying to rebel. And we even see this in today's culture, where the younger group, the younger generation rebels against the older generation. We have that clash of the mentalities and the values and everything. Well, these teenagers didn't want to listened to the same stuff, the big band stuff, and thought that that was kind of just their old music. And they gravitated toward new music that they thought was interesting. And they really looked at African American music artists and they found rhythm and blues and they were like, whoa, Wow. And you'll see that with the second wave of rock specifically when we talk about the Beatles and things like that. Beatles and the Rolling Stones were hugely influenced by R&B and first wave of rockers. All right. Rolling Stones is huge into the blues. All right. It's just totally huge into the blues. So the white teens ended up doing that, and they developed a huge taste for rhythm and blues. And that's where we also get a lot of African American artists getting ripped off, essentially, of their music and getting played by white artists like Bill Haley. And Bill Haley makes a profit while the African American artist is still starving, basically, a starving artist at that point. So the next podcast, this ends it for this podcast episode. But in the next podcast, we're going to start talking about the idea of where rock flourished. How did rock start? Who championed rock? And we'll go into how this all kind of pulled together to create the genre of rock music. Until next time, I'll see you later.